I'd like to once again request Professor Bill Ashcroft to kindly deliver his lecture, and our students are eagerly waiting for you. Over to you, Bill.
We're going to talk about seeing Australia. Now, we think of seeing as quite simple. We open our eyes and the world comes in. But it's much more complicated than that. Seeing is something that has to be done. Now, Oliver Sacks, in an essay called To See and Not See, talks about Virgil, a man who's blind since birth. He receives his sight but has to learn to see. For him, there was light, movement, colour, but all meaningless. Now, says Sacks, we're not given the world. We make our world through incessant experience, categorization, memory, reconnection. But when Virgil opened his eyes after being blind for 45 years, having had little more than an infant's visual experience, there was no world of experience and meaning awaiting him. He saw, but what he saw had no coherence. Virgil had to learn to see, and I want to take this physical issue and see it as a model for cultural seeing. You see, people who came to Australia had to learn to see. There'd been many views of what Australia had been. The Antipodes is the way in which people understood countries on the other side of the world. We have to remember, though, that representation is not simply picturing, but it's the process of giving concrete form to ideological concepts. And so what I'm going to go through now is a series of representations that demonstrate the ways in which seeing Australia is a function of giving concrete form or pictorial form to ideological concepts. Now, for instance, Cook's view of Australia had begun to be formed before he arrived in Australia. And this is true of most, if not all, people who came to this country. Now, Augustine said many centuries ago, even should it be believed or demonstrated that the world is round or spherical in form, it does not follow that the part of the earth opposite to us is not completely covered with water, or that any conjectured dry land there should be inhabited by men. Now, we know today that that is simply not true, but Augustine was half right, because the latitudes that are occupied in the northern hemisphere by most of Europe are in the southern hemisphere occupied by water. But the continents that exist in the southern hemisphere are therefore temperate in nature. But so how did people prepare themselves to see this country? Well, it was either a paradise or a prison. You see, Australia was polarised in the European imagination. It was both a terrifying absence, a place of exile and hardship, and a place of possibility. De Quiros believed perfection could be found in the great south land of the Holy Spirit. In a more imperialistic vein, Froude, who is Oceania or England and her colonies, said colonists would become the progenitors of a people destined to exceed the glories of European civilization, as much as they have outstripped the wonders of ancient enterprise. So there we have two ways in which people expected to experience Australia: the convict experience, the idea of Australia as a dystopian prison, or the experience of those who saw Australia as the chance for a new beginning. of utopian possibility. And so ever since then, Australia has remained in the representation of people who are both here and who want to represent it, has been ambivalent, conflicted, and contradictory. And that is true today. Now, let's have a look at early views of Sydney. And the views of Sydney demonstrate what I'm talking about when I say that representation is giving concrete or pictorial form to ideological concepts. This is a new beginning. The painters, Thomas Watling and Major James Taylor, as we'll see, show that the city, the early pictures of the city demonstrate the ordered construction of colonization, the civilizing benefits of colonization. Early paintings emphasize the idea of order being produced out of wilderness. And on the other hand, there is another stream of representations of Sydney which drew upon the conventions of romantic pictorial art, such as Conrad Martin's. What was seen was determined by received artistic convention. So then we see that the seeing Australia is already a very complicated thing, because people are seeing what they expect to see. They're seeing what the discourse of dystopia or utopia is demonstrating to them. But here's Thomas Watling's A Direct North General View of Sydney Cove. Probably the earliest painting ever painted in Australia, 1794. And here we see a picture of a town that is beginning to demonstrate the ordered nature of occupation and settlement. Now you see the eyes drawn to the two human figures in the center of the painting. So it's the humanization of the wilderness that is important here. Now, interestingly, you won't notice very easily, but over here, there's an Aboriginal campfire off to the side. So already you're seeing a picture of the ways in which society was generating its forms of othering and its forms of control. The picture, see, the thing is interesting, Thomas Watling was a convict, but he is adopting the ideology of colonization to show that the city represents order in the wilderness. A view of the town of Sydney repeats this. Here we see, it's not a very interesting picture, but it's a picture of human civilization beginning to take place in the city, beginning to take place in this wild, antipodal country at the bottom end of the world. And similarly, after Major James Taylor, the entrance of Port Jackson, Sydney in 1823. So you see, what's happening is that the painters are demonstrating the progress of a view of colonization as a force of order and civilization. So it is the pictorial representation of the ideology of the civilizing mission. And the civilizing mission is the wonderful way in which British imperialism justified its well, let's say its robbery of the wealth of the world. So now, Conrad Martin's A View of Sydney and Botany Bay, here we see a very different picture. And again, what we're seeing is not simply a picture of Sydney, we're seeing a representation that is driven by the conventions of romantic pictorial art. So on one hand, Sydney is a place of order, order out of the wilderness, and on the other hand, it's a place of romantic and aesthetic beauty. Again, Elizabeth Bay and Elizabeth House. And so it's a very clear picture of a romantic perception of the city of Sydney. And what I simply point out or repeat is that these pictures, these pictorial representations, are demonstrations in concrete form of particular ideologies, of particular forms of representation. So on one hand, you've got the ideology of colonization, order in the wilderness, and the other, the romantic conventions of painting. So let's have a look. So yeah, okay. So the what's very interesting about the ways in which Australia was represented was the inheritance of European forms of seeing the place, of seeing country. And in the first place, there's an inheritance of the European vertical sublime. Edmund Burke says, whatever is in any sort terrible or is conversant about terrible objects or operates in a manner analogous to terror is the source of the sublime. Mountains with peaks above the clouds, deep gorges, descriptions of raging storms, Milton's portrayal of hell, all arouse enjoyment with horror. And so this idea of enjoyment with horror is central to the notion of the sublime in European tradition. So we see this very famous sublime picture, Caspar Friedrich, Wander Above the Sea Fog. These are, and this one, Thomas Moran, The Chasm of the Colorado. So both in Europe and America, the idea of the sublime is being generated. Here, Nicholas Chevalier in Australia, Mount Arapiles and the Mitre Rock, demonstrates something of the inheritance of this idea of the vertical sublime from Europe. Or Eugene Montgerard, Mount Kosciuszko in 1866. Here we have a continuation of the European idea of the sublime, of the vertical, of awesomeness. Certainly not as awesome as those paintings, those romantic paintings in Europe, but nevertheless a sense of grandeur, a sense of awesomeness. So the interesting thing that I find about this is what I call the horizontal sublime. Now, Addison says that the spacious horizon is an image of liberty. But in Australia, the excess of space engenders the dystopian terror of an absolute displacement intimated by the psychic line of the Australian horizon. Now, around the mid-19th century, a movement begins in Australian art and writing towards a conception of the infinite in the representation of place. Marcus Clarke and Charles Harper are writers who demonstrate this most clearly, but it's most obvious in painting. And I bring this up because I know that my essay, The Sacred in Australia, has been set with the course. And to understand the sacred, it's important to understand the ways in which the idea of the sublime was generated by the excess of space that earlier settlers saw. And we see this in E.C. Fromm's first view of Salt Desert, called Lake Torrens. And here you see what I'm talking about when I say the psychic line of the Australian horizon is something that generates an awesome feeling of space and interminable space. And that is very much at the heart of the ways in which early settlers understood their place in Australia. Here, George French Angus, emus in a plain, and the same idea. The sense of space, the sense of the sublime as a horizontal thing rather than a vertical thing is generated very clearly in the painters in the mid-19th century. Or S.T. Gill, Invalid's Tent, Salt Lake. It's a place in which man is extremely vulnerable. The immensity of Australian space is shown by the distance suggested by the far horizon. And as you know, the idea of its inhospitable nature is generated by the invalid and his tent there in the foreground. Now, this is an interesting thing because it's a photo taken by Sidney Nolan in the 1950s. And the interesting thing about this photo is that it reveals that seeing is not passive. It inherits a sense of the horizontal sublime from colonial times. And this is the mid-20th century. But the photo is not just a photo of a jeep in the desert. It's a photo that inherits that sense of the sublime from the 19th century. So it's extremely interesting the ways in which this occurs. And of course, Nolan would never have thought of himself as repeating that kind of representation. But there it is. It is an inheritance in the ways in which Australia is seen, has come to be seen in the mid-century. Now, the question, what is the sublime, can't be separated from what is the sacred in 18th century philosophy. And the sublime, the enjoyment with horror, the awesomeness, the overwhelming nature of the transcendent is very much a part of the sublime in 18th century philosophy. And that's important to remember, that the sublime is all about the transcendental and in human experience of place. The numinous, the unpresentable, the awesome became projected in the Australian literary and artistic imagination onto the incomprehensible vastness of Australian space. And so out of this Australian displacement, we get a development of an obsession with place, an obsession with belonging, an obsession with wondering how this sense of displacement can be overcome. The horizontal sublime maintains a hold on Australian consciousness, intimating the sacred, the utopian, and the dystopian all at once. Now I'm going to go to a different way of showing this. So in contrast to the horizon sublime is the development in the 19th century of the idea of an Antipodean Arcadia. So we've got the dystopian view of the horizontal sublime, and now you have the utopian idea of this place as an Arcadia, a fruitful and a fecund place. It's a picture of utopian fecundity, balances the representation of Australia as a place of extreme distances and hostile climate. And so understand that representing Australia in these different paintings is the demonstration of a different kind of ideology, a different discourse. It's a discourse of a people trying to inhabit a place that at first seems hostile, but now, and driven largely by the discourse of imperialism and colonialism, the place is seen to be a fertile Arcadia. It's the emerging view of Australia as Europe's farm. Now, this is something that Australia really hasn't shaken itself out of. And while it's not so much Europe's farm today, it is the supplier of minerals. It digs things up from the earth. And so this explains why Australia has been pretty backward in manufacturing things. All it needs to do is dig up stuff or sell wheat or wool to Europe and make a profit. The Arcadian depictions that are following are not simply pictures, but are telling a story about the richness and productivity of place. Now, John Glover's A View of the House and Garden is an interesting one because it demonstrates the idea of fertility, of domesticity. That hill in the background is overly pointed to contrast with the flat plain in front around the house where the flowers and vegetables are growing. His My Harvest Home is a very interesting depiction of the way in which Australia is beginning to see itself as a place of farming and productivity, a place of developing the products that it can sell to Europe. So this is not just, it's not just about economics. This is about Australians trying to see themselves as occupying a place in a rich and fruitful way. Robert Dowling's Jeremiah Ware's Stock and Minja Station. Now, there's a common thing for rich graziers to get pictures of their stock painted so that to demonstrate their wealth. And this is one such thing. It's a large paddock with the cattle being painted. And again, it's about the occupation, the fruitful occupation of this place, which at first has seemed hostile and a sublime, awesome place. But now it's a place of fruitfulness and productivity. These next two paintings are very interesting because there's a combination of the horizontal sublime and the Arcadian. Here's a picture of a homestead. It's a homestead gathered around a dam or a lake that gives very much the story of fruitful occupation, and yet it's set in a setting that looks very much like those things earlier in the century. And again, Lake Notuk in 1857. This is a picture of the horizontal sublime beginning to be approached with a more friendly attitude, approached with a sense of domesticity. So let's think about place and language. Henry Kendall's Bellbirds writes about the bush in the way Martens paints, according to received technique. But we begin to see the beginnings of Australian English. And so just as those paintings have inherited the European forms of representation. So the language begins to take its own direction. And I'll show you just one example of this. Henry Kendall's Bellbirds, it says, by channels of coolness, the echoes are calling, and down the dim gorges I hear the creek falling. It lives in the mountain where moss and the sedges touch with their beauty the banks and the ledges. Through breaks of the cedar and sycamore boughs struggles the light that is love to the flowers, and softer than slumber and sweeter than singing, the notes of the bellbirds are running and ringing. Now, this poem could easily have been written in England, okay? It's a poem that is entirely conversant and owes its rhythm and structure to the principles of English verse. But there's something begins to change. The word creek. Now, the word creek is a word, a Midlands word for a body of water. And it's adopted here, it's appropriated to describe a stream. And so in this simple way, we see the way in which the language is being appropriated and the emergence of a distinctive Australian diction is coming into being. So this is a very small crack in the observance of English representation, but it is something that leads to a distinctive Australian English. Now, late in the 19th century, there's the emergence of the Heidelberg School. Now, the Heidelberg School claimed to be seeing Australia truly, and it's a school of painting developed out of the suburbs, what is now a suburb of Melbourne, but was outside of Melbourne. And it's a school that developed a form of painting that claimed to be seeing Australia truly, but at the same time, it was seeing a nation. The 1890s was a nationalist period in Australia, and it is demonstrated very clearly in the paintings of the Heidelberg School. So the Impressionist painters attempted to free themselves from European painting techniques. Plein air painting attempted to give a true impression of Australian place. But of course, the plein air technique was something developed in France, and they have inherited and appropriated the plein air technique because there is a nationalist push to see Australia not in the ways in which English painters have seen it, but as it really is. And now, of course, this is always a questionable thing. But the emphasis was on trying to capture the light and heat of Australia. And there was a radical change in the role of the sun during the period of 1890s nationalism. What had been seen to be innovating and causing the Australian lassitude was now seen to be a source of health and vitality. And it's been called by David Walker meteorological patriotism. So by the 1890s, the way of seeing Australia was very much generated by this emerging idea of the sun as a thing of beauty, of vitality, as well as fertility. Charles Conder's Holiday at Mentone captures the light. Here we see a beach, which again is a very Australian scene, a very Australian location. And in 1888, the sense of light is given by the shadows, and Conder's attempt was to capture the light, as it was for most of the Heidelberg painters. Arthur Streeton's Golden Summer gives a very strong sense of the heat of the Australian farm or station. The sheep there in the shadow, and the contrast between the shadow and the grass gives a very strong sense of the shimmering heat of the Australian place, as does this painting near Heidelberg. So there's, on one hand, as I said, there's that idea of representing a true Australia, an Australia of light and heat. But on the other hand, there was an attempt to demonstrate the Australian people, to depict people in relation to place. Now, I'm going through a few of this: the lost child myth, the relationship with the bush of the bushman, the hard masculine labour of shearer, bushman and horseman. And the pioneers that we'll look at in this group is a picture of national images as a continuation of colonialism. And that's interesting because nationalism was trying to break away from the British yoke, but at the same time, it was a continuation of that sense of the growth of civilization. So here's the idea of the painting of a lost child. Now, the lost child is a classic myth of the Australian bush because, well, many children were lost in the bush, but it became a metaphor for the sense of threat that society, that the settler society felt from the wilderness, from the bush. And so the lost child became a motif for the settler colonies' sense of displacement, of threat in the Australian bush. This painting called Down on His Luck is about a swaggy. Now it's interesting, he may be down on his luck, but look at the way in which the colour has been made. The fellow's clothes are the same colour, the same tones as the place. So he may be down on his luck, but he is at home. He's at home in place. And this is a representation that is driven by the notion of Australians becoming at home in an Australian place. But at the same time, it's a place where people, the struggle to create a property is always at risk of the threat of disease and of death. Now, Tom Roberts Shearing the Rams is a very famous painting, but it was lambasted and critiqued by an art critic at the time, who said it's really got nothing aesthetically beautiful about it. But Roberts said that the depiction of strong manual labour was distinctly Australian. So what's happening here is the depiction of Australian people in the country is very much at the heart of this nationalist period. Tom Roberts, also The Breakaway, shows the drover, the horseman, trying to stop a stampede of sheep. This painting by Frederick Cullen, The Pioneer, is very interesting because it's a triptych, 3 panels. And the first one on the left, we see the woman dreaming about the future. In the middle one, the pioneer and his wife are talking. She now has a baby, as you see, but in the distance, you see their house, which has been built. And in the third panel, the man is attending to his wife's grave. They have weathered the bush. They have gone through their life. And in the distance, you see the approaching city. The pioneer has carved a way for the rest of civilization to follow. And so this idea of the civilizing mission is generated even in this nationalistic depiction of a pioneer carving away in the bush. So, unlearning the visible world. How do we talk about this? We've talked about learning the visible world, and we've talked about the ways in which early painters demonstrated the society's capacity to learn. But now modernism in Australia is where we begin to see a kind of unlearning. Now, there's a myth that modernism was a belated arrival from Europe, and that's the myth of belatedness. But there's many arguments against this. And Andrew Milner says Australia, was modern before modernity, and there was a strong anti-modernist movement at the time. The Nietzschean vitalism of Norman Lindsay and the Vision School were very anti-modernist. The Academy of Art, and at the time, the man who became Prime Minister, Robert Menzies, was the president of the Academy of Art. And the Academy believed in the sustaining the Impressionist landscape painting. They said the landscape Impressionism was real Australian painting. But what's happening is modernism is disturbing, disrupting, and critiquing that inherited idea of Australia. And along with the modernism goes a critique of privilege and poverty. And the urbanisation of Australia leads to a perception of class struggle. So Albert Tucker's Spring in Fitzroy, a poor and possibly starving man looking out in 1941. Albert Tucker's images of modern evil, this is done during the war, and victory girls. So they, on one hand, you've got a sense of the dark side, if you like, of Australian urban life. And again, in old Coonahan, lady with fox fur, you've got the distinction between a lady with a fur and a man struggling with a sack, a very distinct demonstration of class division. And before the march by Noel Coonahan, of course, it would have been a march for workers' rights. And here you see poverty-stricken people waiting to march in support of rights for the workers and for the poor. Albert Tucker's Intruder and Parrots. Now it's interesting, who's the intruder? Well, the intruder is an explorer. And Albert Tucker is recasting the heroic story of explorers and their conquering of the bush and their leading towards the development of Australia. And he, in this painting, the explorer becomes an intruder. So Sidney Nolan and Arthur Boyd also are reimagining, they're showing a revision. And of course, the interesting thing about this painting, of course, is that we can see the sky through Ned Kelly's helmet. And what I think is happening here is that Sidney Nolan is looking at this classic image of Australian myth and looking through it to a possibility of a different kind of world. Now, the rose Arthur Boyd, river and flood with carcass and rose. The rose symbolises imposition and the cultural arrogance of the English as they tried to make a little England in Australia. Now, this is Arthur Boyd's words. I was trying to show the fragility of transporting this culture into such a harsh environment. The rose and carcass are contrasting symbols. They are forced together in recognition of the anomaly of colonisation. So what we are beginning to get here in the modernist period is something that we didn't actually get fully in the nationalist period. You think of nationalism as something that would be anti-colonial, anti-imperial, but there was a very strong, in the 1890s, a very strong force of what are called imperial loyalists or national loyalists. That is, they are both nationalist and believed in the empire. Sadly, that's true of Australia today as well. And so Shoalhaven River with Rose, Burning Book and Aeroplane. Again, this Rose is a critique of the inheritance of British imperialism, and it's shown the way to a different kind of view of Australia. Now, we have to understand that this view has not taken over in Australia, but Australia remains ambivalent, conflicted, with differing views of Europe, of England, of the empire. And that's why the extraordinary thing is that Australia still is not a republic. But the interesting thing about this modernist period is the importance of women in between the wars was the underrepresented women artists, writers who made the most innovative advances. And Grace Cossington Smith's painting of the Harbour Bridge, an affirmation of industrial modernisation and the human work involved and the process of reconstructing place. And Margaret Preston's Aboriginal influence. This is very interesting. We look at the Aboriginal influence on Margaret Preston. It's remarkable for what it cannot say, as much for the image of possibility it represents. There's no school, no tradition to initiate. But there's the Grace Cossington Smith's The Lacquer Room, a kind of modernist depiction of contemporary society. And here's the curve of the bridge. Industrial progress was very much at the heart of the modernist period. And this is the construction of the bridge was very much a modernist enterprise. These four panels, I included this because it's an interesting modernist depiction of Australian place. Australian place in four different views and four different locatory, gum and wattle trees, waterfall and picnic in a gully. So what you're beginning to see in the modernist period is a different way of approaching Australian place, of seeing Australia. Here's Margaret Preston, her Aboriginal landscapes. You can see the ways in which Aboriginal colours and the Aboriginal formulas entering her painting. Shoalhaven Gorge, and again, Ridge from the Rocks. Even this gives a sense of the Aboriginal art form. Now, that leads us to seeing Aboriginal Australia. An Aboriginal seeing. Now, we have to remember that European culture is deeply oculocentric. That is, seeing is everything. Seeing is knowing. And the words for knowing and all the different kinds of synonyms for knowing all come back to the process of seeing. So Aristotle was very keen on the primacy of sight, makes us know and brings us to light the many differences between things. For him, sight and seeing was profoundly important. I see equals I know. and the Greek ido, Latin video. So the connection between seeing and knowledge is absolutely fundamental to the oculocentric nature of European discourse. But anyway, there's some questions there. Is poetic imagery purely visual? Aboriginal seeing conflates time and space in interesting ways. The dreaming is cosmogonic and cosmological, and the important features of the Aboriginal landscape are transmogrifications of dreaming figures, as Uluru, which is now a protected Aboriginal site. Galway Unipingu says, most great paintings talk about the land and the significance of the land. Aboriginal people use other forms of art to talk about the land, for example, bark paintings and the dance. When I get out and paint myself and go bush, whether I'm performing a sacred ceremony or corroboree, I'm performing an art that talks about the land. When Aboriginal people get together, we put the land into action. When I perform, the land is within me, and I am the only one who can move, land doesn't. So I represent the land when I dance. I pretend to be the land because the land is part of me. So I perform whatever I do on behalf of the land. Now, understand how different this is from the oculocentric nature of European culture. That seeing is knowing for the settler colonist, but for the Aboriginal person, being is knowing, and performing is knowing, and being in is knowing. And so the land becomes something that's not just seen, but something that is inhabited and performed. Now, I'm going through these Aboriginal paintings are a demonstration of a particular Aboriginal aesthetic, which is about land. They look like they may be abstract paintings, but in fact, all these paintings are about the land and the dreaming. And when we think of this Aboriginal painting, there's some arguments that have arisen. Is it traditional or is it authentic? The use of contemporary materials is, in 1971, Geoffrey Barton encouraged Aboriginal painters to take up dot painting. And so the culture, but I want to suggest that, culture is never static, but continually mobile and transformative. So the idea of arguing about Aboriginal painting because they use contemporary materials is just irrelevant. Culture is never static, but continually mobile and transformative. That's true of all cultures. And one of the things, the important aspects of post-colonial societies is that the future is always built on memory, not as nostalgia, but as a realization of the continuation of culture and cultural life. So Aboriginal art is a peripheral, or is it an alternative modernity? Now, Lynn Onus is a very interesting painter who painted many paintings that look to be European in nature. But look at this painting, it's called Twice Upon a Time. The reason it's called that is because it's recasting this painting of evening shadows, backwater of the Murray, back in 1880. And when you look at it, you see there are no Aboriginal inhabitants here. There's a gunya, and the barbed wire across the painting gives you the symbol of not just imprisonment, but also of danger and suffering. So ways of seeing Australia have become diversified by a transcultural consciousness. While art can embed a habit of seeing, it also provides the continuous source of unlearning and relearning. as we see in the landscapes of Fred Williams. Williams' paintings enter a space between the purely visual and the embodied, and this reveals the revolutionary cultural power of creativity, particularly the textual forms of art and literature. And I'll just briefly, let's have a look at Fred Williams' painting the land is quite abstract. It's a different view of the land. It gives a feeling of the land that goes beyond the seeing. And so, yeah, the another painting by him, Listerfield Landscape in 1973, and Red Landscape. And these paintings, and they'll be available through the recording, are paintings that demonstrate the ways in which seeing Australia has developed. Now, I don't want to make too much of the fact that Aboriginal ways of seeing, of inhabiting, have in fact, influenced contemporary painting, but I think it's there. And the question of Australian culture in the 21st century can't escape the significance of the granting land rights to Eddie Mabo back in the 1990s. So I just want to finish by suggesting we think about the future. Ernst Bloch's Vorschein, or anticipatory illumination. This is how art and literature assume their utopian function, for they are the means through which human beings form themselves, conceive their questions about themselves, and portray the possibility of obtaining their objectives. The quotidian horizon, the terror of infinite extent, becomes modified by familiarity. And horizon in the mature transcultural nation becomes the trope of possibility. And I want to leave you with that. The horizontal sublime that we saw as awesome and threatening has, in the transcultural nation, become an image of possibility and of the future. So thank you very much. I'm not sure how our time has gone. Okay. Just, I might have taken 5 minutes too long, but
Dear Professor.
okay.
Dear Professor Ashcroft, can you hear me?
I can hear you, yes.
Yes. So as a long-time student of Australian literature, I thought really he was speaking of anticipatory illumination, Professor, but I thought we were all kindled and illuminated by your presentation. Each one of which was, I mean, the various slides and what you said, it would not only inspire me to teach the sacred in Australian culture, which I read with our students, but the pictorial dimension that you gave, yes, and the unlearnings you talked about, and looking at literature as that healing space, as well as that zone of a time machine where otherness is possible, other possibilities, as a matrix of alterities, literature and painting as that. I thought inspired and kindled me, and I very much believe our students too. Thank you for that illuminating lecture. And I would now open the house along with Sharbajit বিশ্বাস for questions for our students. So thank you for your time, really. And Paul, thank you for being there too. Okay, sir. Thank you so much.
Oh, thank you. Thanks.
এখানে আছে Yeah, thank you, Bill. I'll just ask our students if they have any question for you. I believe. Oh, yes. Any questions? Anyone? Am I audible? Yes.
I know there's a lot
Yes,
there.
we have one question from
Okay.
Ishita. Yes. Ishita, you may ask your question.
Okay, sir. First of all, thank you so much, sir, for this wonderful talk. I have a very simple query. In almost every indigenous writing, there is an element of trauma. They look back at their past, they return to their dream time to reserve and preserve their sacred. When I go through the writings of the indigenous authors, I try to explore them under the lens of memory studies and trauma studies. My question is, sir, is there any other theoretical framework that can be used to analyze and also to understand the Aboriginal literature and culture better?
Well, yes, there's a great deal of work that is available to analyse not only Aboriginal culture and Aboriginal history, but also the ways in which Aboriginal culture have impacted on Australian society. There's a very interesting book now, well, two books about the impact of Mabo. Now, the Mabo decision was the granting of land title to Eddie Mabo, and it was a major event in Australia because it was a legal conclusion that Aboriginal people had a legal right to their historic lands. Now, the interesting thing about this, of course, is that the post-Mabo has generated a whole stream of different ways of seeing Australia. I would recommend that if you can get a hold of that, those books on post-Mabo discourse, then you'll have a very clear picture of the ways in which Aboriginal society, despite the ways in which they've been marginalised and oppressed, have begun to transform Australian society, Australian culture. And so I would say that would be the thing that I'd suggest, because apart from that, there's a huge wealth of evidence of discussion of Aboriginal culture. But the interesting thing to me is the ways in which Aboriginal culture has interpolated Australian culture in general. And that in reference to what might be on your course material, the idea of the sacred, while the Aboriginal sense of the sacred is not in itself been taken up by Australians. The notion of the sacred that is generated in Aboriginal society has a very large impact on Australian views of the sacred, and I've talked about that in the article that I think is set for your course. So those things I would recommend. But thanks for your question.
Thank you so much. Yeah, thank you so much, Bill, for that. And I believe there are no other questions from our students. So I think we can end here.
All right.
And once again, thank you so much, for your
Thank you.
time.
Thank
You're taking time out of your busy schedule.
Okay.
And what I hope is maybe next year or the year after, you come back to us and we have another conference if you are free. Then we can plan something.
Well, I'd love to do that when COVID